And that is basically, let me find my files for it. If you're in my folder, I'm going to look at the GI test images. So this is, throw these into Photoshop because I can't look at real images. All right, so this is basically global illumination. And it's basically what it is additional, it's calculating bounce light. So practically speaking, like if you look at this render, this is with no global illumination at all. Basically the setup for this scene is, images. It's basically just like a random box with some objects in it and a single light just hanging out on one side. That's my flashlight. My bad. Oh, right. Sorry, if you guys are looking for this file, it is under source images. It's under the IES light pack because I'm weird and saved it in the wrong spot. But this is basically the scene setup. I made it the same for the Arnold and Redshift test. This is the only light in my scene, and it's just facing away from this green wall. So again, if you look at this, it doesn't look particularly nice as an image. The shadows are completely black. This whole wall is completely black. It's kind of gross looking. So practically speaking, if I looked at your stuff last week for your lighting and I was like, oh, you know, some of the, it's a daylight scene, like I would expect more bounce light going back and hitting the wall behind the window kind of thing. If you're in Maya, global illumination will fix that. You can also kind of fudge it with a bunch of additional lights. But, so again, no global illumination. This is Arnold's default of using one bounce of global illumination. And you can see like everything kind of looks less trashy. Like this light is actually lit up a little bit. There's some bounce light from this wall coming and hitting the ball here, so it's a little bit red. And there's like a little bit of green coming here. You can see on the bottom of each of the spheres there is light from the floor being reflected. So again, this is basically just calculating bounce light. In terms of like a real world example of sitting in this room, ignoring the fact that all the computers are basically just like tiny sources of light, most of the light in this room is coming from that, you know, one bank of windows. And the wall behind those windows is still lit up. Again, that's just because the light is coming into the room, it's bouncing off the walls, the computers, all of you sitting in this room, and then it's bouncing back onto that wall to light it up. So that's pretty much what global illumination is doing. It's just calculating bounce light. Any questions on what global illumination actually is, or like what it's doing in your scene? All right. So it is helpful if you're doing, again, you just have like one window in your scene and you don't want to add in a bunch of extra lights to sort of fudge this lighting. Just turn on GI. It takes a while to render, but it does look really pretty and real-worldy, and it saves you a lot of trouble lighting. I'll show you guys where the settings are in a moment. But for Arnold, this is actually default. It's on with one ray, just normally. If you go on your sampling tab, there's like a setting for like ray depth or whatever, and that's where the settings are in Arnold. But I'll go over that specifically in a second. So, all right. So again, Arnold default with one ray of global illumination. If I set the rays up to 5, you can see that the whole room lightens up a little bit more. So 1 ray, 5 rays. Basically, when it says rays, or like, basically what's happening is if you set the little sliders up to be higher numbers, it's calculating more bounces per ray. So if it's shooting out 1 ray of light, this is with no bounces, no rays. It's hitting this and stopping. And it's like, cool, I've hit an object, my light's done, I'm not calculating anymore. If you hit it once, so right now the light's hitting the red wall, and then it's bouncing off of that red wall and hitting this. At this point it's stopping, but that's why you get a little bit of that red in this ball here. And then with more global illumination, it's pretty much hits red wall, hits ball here, maybe goes back onto the red wall, and then like back onto the ball. It's basically, again, just calculating more bounces. So the more you do this, a lot of times what happens is your scene effectively gets brighter looking, and you'll also get like these reflections on the ball are hotter. So you can see like here there's like way more green compared to the 1 ray where there's like pretty much none. So again, fiddle with the sliders to do whatever kind of makes sense for your scene and gets it to look nice. But that's more or less what global illumination is. And just for the record, in case anybody was unclear what a watermark looks like, I did a similar test in Redshift, which I do not have a real license of on my computer. If I see this on your images, that giant text that says Redshift or Arnold, I'm taking off points. If you guys are using Redshift on your personal computers, you have a trial version, it's going to watermark anything you do, like it has here. Bring your stuff into the labs, render on a real computer, and it will remove that watermark. But anywho, so again, pretty much the exact same thing, just in Arnold, in Redshift. But yeah. So that is basically global illumination. In terms of actually getting this set up in your settings. So this is the Arnold scene that I'm working with. It's like AI GI test 1. So I'm just going to go ahead and render this. So this is what Arnold defaults you to. Again, one ray of global illumination. If you open your render settings, they haven't called it, I'm gonna say GI from now on, because I can't say global illumination to save my life. They don't actually call it GI anywhere, like Redshift actually just has a GI tab. But if you go into this little Arnold box, or like Arnold renderer box where you usually find your sampling info, go down to this tab called Ray Depth, and that is where you find your settings for GI. So again, you can see the settings that you usually are going to tweak are diffuse and specular. You can also fiddle with the other ones. By default, they're set a little bit higher. So transmission is like for glass and stuff, that just needs more sampling. So if I set diffuse and specular down to 0, you can see that my scene immediately starts looking like trash. If I set diffuse up higher, you can kind of see that like the higher I go, it ends up being like the lighter the scene ends up in the end. It reaches a threshold where it kind of just like evens out and stops getting significantly brighter. But usually I'll go somewhere for both diffuse and specular of somewhere maybe like 3 to 5 samples is like fairly reasonable. Again, you can play with specular too. I don't have anything shiny in here, so it's not really doing anything. But this is, again, basically just saying how many times do you want the light rays to bounce off of your objects before we stop calculating them. And that's honestly pretty much how you set up GI in Arnold. Are there any questions about that? All right. So again, you're just looking for the little ray depth tab here. Most of it is modified diffuse and specular. If you're doing, is anyone actually using Redshift for anything? All right. I have the file here, so I'll go over it really fast. It's also fairly straightforward to set up. So in this case, I'm just going to be looking for this RSGI test, which is also in my IES light pack because I'm a maniac. All right, so again, here's my Arnold scene. My Redshift scene. I pretty much recreated what I had in my Arnold one. That's not right. Please render my thing. All right. Cool. All right. So if you guys are looking for the settings for GI and Arnold, or in Redshift, my bad. So open your render settings. If it still defaults to showing you the settings for Arnold, just this little render using dropdown, just set that to Redshift. It'll swap out all of the menus. But you can see that Redshift actually has a setting for, or a dedicated tab for GI. So just click on that. And then by default, this is set to nothing. For primary and secondary engine, it'll just be none. And this is like the image that it kicks out, which is pretty ugly. So usually, this is kind of the way that I was taught to set up GI and Redshift. For primary engine, you want to select photon map, and secondary engine, usually you'll use brute force. I think these basically all just calculate the global illumination differently. Sometimes I like go back and fiddle between like photon map and a radiance cache, and I haven't visually noticed a huge difference. But this is just the settings that I usually use, because again, it's kind of like what was taught to me, and that's just kind of like what I do, because it does seem to work pretty much all the time. So this is here, you can see the image with a little bit of like GI and bounce light on. If you wanted to, you could up the number of GI bounces. Very tangible way to basically adjust the number of times the rays are going to hit stuff. And again, the higher you go, usually the brighter your scene is going to end up. So you can kind of see it in, if I maybe just like segregate this little area here. So you can kind of see this. So this is GI bounces, and then the more I add, this green wall has lightened up considerably. There's more bounce light from the bottom of here. So again, usually if you add more bounces, it's just going to lighten your whole scene. But that's pretty much GI and Redshift. Again, also relatively straightforward to set up. So any questions on GI or like why you'd want to use it, how to set it up in any of the renderers? All right, cool.